So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Science Corner discussion on the philosophy and life and work of Georg Henrik von Wright and Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm happy and proud to introduce our guest, Sir Anthony Kenny, who will give the first Georg Henrik von Wright lecture tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. So you are also welcome tomorrow to his his lecture on anthropomorphism and humanism. Now, Professor Kenny is a distinguished British philosopher with a fine career in Oxford University. He has written on the history of philosophy, from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas to Descartes and Wittgenstein. And he was also a close personal friend of the Finnish philosopher Georg Henrik von Wright. One of the topics which they shared and cooperated was the literary output of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein Nachlass. And it is known that in 1951, January 29th, Wittgenstein wrote in his will that he will give the copyright of all his unpublished writings to three persons: Russ Rees, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Georg Henrik von Wright, who was his successor as professor of philosophy in the University of Cambridge. 4 months later, Wittgenstein then died, and these three persons started to work as the literary executors and trustees of the Wittgenstein Nachlass. And later in 1989, these three persons nominated their successors as trustees, and von Wright nominated Anthony Kenny as his successor. So they have cooperated closely with this material. and of course this task of editing Wittgenstein's manuscripts and notes has been an enormous effort. It took something like 50 years to complete that task, and there were many disputes and controversies also on this topic. So this is the background of the discussion today, and we will have some questions between the two of us, and then I invite the audience to raise some questions about von Wright and Wittgenstein. But could I first ask you, Professor Kenny, to say something about your personal relations to Georg Henrik von Wright?
Well, we were close friends. Mainly, of course, our relations were by correspondence, because I was living in England. Henrik had long left Cambridge, but I did visit Helsinki 3 or 4 times, and he came to Cambridge, where he had still a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge, and we. I think had a great agreement on the style of philosophy that was the correct style. That was, we both accepted the view of Wittgenstein that philosophy was not a science, that it was something different from the natural or social sciences, and it was different, say, from scientific linguistics. We thought that science was in pursuit of information, in pursuit of facts, in pursuit of knowledge, which was something different from philosophy, that a philosopher, according to Wittgenstein, and we accepted this, a philosopher doesn't have any knowledge that other people don't have, doesn't have access to information or a special way of gathering information, Rather, what the philosopher does is to try to organize the information that we have from various sources, to try to understand the structure of sciences rather than the actual information of sciences, but to try, first of all, to understand the structure of our own everyday knowledge, because that is what everything, including science, has to begin from. Now, this view of Wittgenstein's was, and I think remains, a minority view. So to that extent, we were brought together by being in a minority of philosophical thinkers around the world. We became closest, of course, when Georg Henrik asked me to be his successor and associate in the supervision of the publication of Wittgenstein's remains. I was appointed as his successor, but he asked me already to come to all the meetings while he was still alive. I don't know if some of you remember in Roman history, the Emperor Diocletian, having decided that the empire was getting too big just for one emperor, he divided it into two empires with two existing emperors, each called an Augustus, and two successors, each called a Caesar. So I like to think of myself as being Caesar to Georg Henrik's Augustus. He was keen for me to join him, I think, for a special reason. A number of difficulties had arisen in the administration of the Wittgenstein Nachlass as to what was to be published and who should be entrusted with publishing them, in which he and Elizabeth Anscombe, one of his fellow trustees, didn't always agree. And because I was a very old friend of Elizabeth Anscombe, Georg Henrik thought, I think, that I would help him. And so I saw my role as being a peacemaker, in a way, between these two great titans of philosophy, Elizabeth Anscombe and Georg Henrik. So for the years, the rest of his life, he and I he would come to Cambridge once a year, I would come to Helsinki in alternate years, and of course we constantly corresponded, and I did my best to keep the peace among the trustees.
Now, one point related to your remark on the method of philosophy, which was shared by von Wright and Wittgenstein. Sometimes it is claimed and thought that there is a very sharp distinction between younger Wittgenstein of the Tractatus and the later Wittgenstein, and there are sort of differences in that respect. How would you relate that issue to von Wright, who had his background also in logic?
Well, I think that there are very important differences between the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations, the posthumous work of Wittgenstein. Indeed, it's a remarkable feature of Wittgenstein that he was willing completely to revise his earlier opinions, even though it had been acclaimed as a philosophical masterpiece and had indeed been taken almost as a Bible by the logical positivists and so on. I think only the very greatest philosophers are prepared to completely renounce what they have earlier published. The greatest of all philosophers, Plato, did that, of course. In his Republic and his dialogues of the same time, he presents the theory of ideas or forms. But then in his later dialogues, the Theaetetus, the Parmenides, and so on, he subjects his earlier ideas to absolutely devastating criticism, much more devastating than successive people have done. Aristotle, of course, criticized him, and it may be that some of the criticisms which Plato puts to himself in his own dialogues originated in discussions with Aristotle. But so you have Plato willing to completely deconstruct his earlier philosophy. Kant, in a similar way, completely revises and renounces his pre-critical philosophy with his critiques. And Wittgenstein, having published the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, then completely rethinks its foundations. But one thing which is common to his both the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations is this idea that I began with, that philosophy is not a science. That is explicit in both of them. But the way in which philosophy relates to science becomes slightly different, I think, in the investigations, because there he relates. Logic is not something sort of underpinning science. Science is, on the other hand, embedded in the social practices from which our ordinary inquiries begin. I published a popular book on Wittgenstein shortly after his death, which was for many years used as a textbook by many people. And in that book, I emphasized the continuity between the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations. And I remember once saying to Georg Henrik, I think that if you have to choose between a single Wittgenstein and two Wittgensteins, you should think of a single Wittgenstein as developing. And Georg Henrik said to me, the choice is not between one Wittgenstein and two Wittgensteins, it is between one Wittgenstein and three Wittgensteins. He had just been working on Wittgenstein's uncertainty. And I think there are almost as great differences between uncertainty and the philosophical investigations as there are between the investigations and the Tractatus. And I think the uncertainty is obviously on the face of it unfinished work, and those of us who are proud to have learnt from Wittgenstein have been left the task of trying to carry on the work which Wittgenstein left unfinished.
So the Tractatus was the only book that Wittgenstein published during his lifetime. Yes. So our whole picture of Wittgenstein as a philosopher is based on the editorial work of the trustees. So it must have been a very serious and demanding task for the trustees to create Wittgenstein from the manuscripts. How would you describe the manuscript material, which is very extraordinary collection of handwritten notes and material?
Yes, so Wittgenstein was an obsessive note taker, I mean, notes of his own thoughts, and rewrote them many times and reshuffled them many times, and of course was never really satisfied with the various forms which he did at one time try to write a complete book, drew up a list of chapters and so on, but he could never get around to publishing it. I think it was something in his own character that felt that if his work was to be published, it should be published by other people after his death. And I often think that in choosing his three literary executors, the trustees of his estate, he was reflecting three different facets of his own character. There was, at least in the later Wittgenstein, a strong sort of mystical streak. And I think the Welsh philosopher Rush Rhys corresponded to the mystical streak. Of course, there was a logical streak in Wittgenstein, particularly in the Tractatus. And I think that he thought of Georg Henrik as the kind of corresponding to the rational, logical side of his mind. Anscombe I think of as corresponding, as it were, to the psychological side of his mind. Psychological in the sense of philosophical psychology. I think that he thought of Anscombe as the person to carry on his investigations into philosophy of mind, into philosophical psychology. Now, it would be quite wrong to say that Georg Henrik was a pure austere logician, and of course it became further and further from the truth as he got older. But I think that these probably were the kind of considerations in Wittgenstein's mind in choosing three such different people as his executors. And of course they led to some of the later difficulties in getting these three people to see things with in a similar way. I'd like briefly to reflect on what I knew of each of them. Ries was the one I knew least. I only got to know him when I was asked to do an English translation of the book which had been published as Philosophische Grammatik, edited by Rush Ries. In doing the English translation, I came to realize that Ries had done something rather odd. He was really supposed to publish a typescript which had been left by Wittgenstein called the Big Typescript, that was its nickname, which was the nearest to a publishable book that Wittgenstein ever wrote. But I discovered that what Ries had published were really selections, considerable selections from this, guided, I think, by Ries's own thought, rather than as just a presentation of Wittgenstein. The whole thing has now been published, but it, well, I would when I had difficulties with translating passages, of course, I would go and see Ries and discuss with him. These were alarming occasions because Ries had an extremely fierce dog, a dog whose mouth came up to about there on me, and whenever I rang the doorbell would growl most fiercely. Eventually Ries would appear and with great... But Ries was also quite small, and I wasn't sure he was quite strong enough to prevent this dog from biting me. But however, it never happened that I was actually bitten. But Ries didn't like what I was doing at all. I mean, I owe him quite a lot because he would correct some of my mistranslations. But I wanted to publish a preface showing the differences between the original Wittgenstein manuscript and what he had published. Ries refused to allow that, saying it would come between Wittgenstein and the reader. What I thought was actually it would show how much Ries had come between Wittgenstein and the reader. But I'm afraid relations I then later published as a contribution to a von Frischschrift at some time, an essay called From the Big Typescript to the Philosophische Grammatik, and I'm afraid Ries didn't ever speak to me again after that. The one of the three that I knew best was Elizabeth Anscombe, and my relationship with her went through three stages. I first knew her when I was a graduate student at Oxford. In my career I had a false start as a Roman Catholic priest, and I was at Oxford as a graduate student while I was still a priest, and it was through the Catholic friends that I got to know Elizabeth Anscombe and her husband Peter Geach. During this period she was extraordinarily kind to me. I was never formally supervised by her as a graduate student. My supervisor was Anthony Quinton, who was not as good a philosopher as Anscombe by any means, but he was very useful as a supervisor. he could read the longest book in 8 hours. And he would let me know which books were worth reading and which were not worth reading. So my supervisions with him were a great pleasure, because mainly he would say they were not worth reading. I would go away and read the ones he told me were worth reading. But most of the philosophical guidance I got, I was writing a thesis which was eventually published under the title Action, Emotion and Will. Most of this philosophical enlightenment really came from Elizabeth, who also let me look at a lot of unpublished Wittgenstein papers. She was extraordinarily generous to her students. If she thought you were a serious student, you could knock on her door any hour of the day, and if she was busy, she would say, go away. But normally she would let you come in. You could discuss philosophy while she was feeding her babies or whatever. And there was always the feeling that as long as you were going to be seriously philosophy, there were no bars at all. There was only when I became a philosophy professor myself did I realize how extraordinarily generous this is. She but then when I left the Roman Catholic Church and got married and so on, she then would not have any more social relations with me. It was not until we began having business relations as Wittgenstein trustees through von Wright that we came together again. I didn't have similar difficulties with her husband, Peter Geach, who died just a few months ago. My relationship with them went through a strange sort of circle, because initially Peter Geach was immensely fierce. He would shout down people in philosophical discussions, and Elizabeth would have to go up to him and say, quiet down, quiet, Peter. Later in life, it was quite the other way around. It was Peter who was the gentle, domestic kind of person, and Elizabeth who was the person who needed quieting down. Well, with I never had any of these dramatic relationships with Georg Henrik. We always got on extremely well together. I found it interesting the way in which his philosophical interests moved as he got older away from the formal logic. Of course, he was the inventor of deontic logic and did a good deal of formalization of logic of action. But shortly before he died, he told me that he thought maybe deontic logic had been a mistake. I'm not quite sure why, but I think he thought that formalization was not really the best way to deal with ethical matters. And I, in my own career, in a more humble way, I had similar experience. During the middle part of my life, I was anxious to formulate the logic of practical reasoning from ends to means, from goals to methods and so on. Something which Aristotle had tried and very clearly failed, and which there had been some studies of imperative logic, I think mainly in Scandinavia. And I was trying, for example. That's right, yes, Alf Ross. Yes, yeah. And I thought, what I would really like to contribute to philosophy would be formalizing it. After about 5 years, and a lot of systems which I wisely never published, I gave up this idea and decided, I don't know whether perhaps somebody in this room or somebody at least in this country has succeeded since, but I gave up the idea of formalizing practical logic. And I think that this was something that we had in common, of having had a great respect for formalization, we had come to think less highly of it as a way of solving, not in itself, it's a very valuable activity, but as a way of solving deep philosophical problems. I think we had both moved away from it. Georg Henrik was more worried, I think, by the problems of the contemporary world than I was, though his reasons for worrying were very serious reasons. So that I found myself very often in the position of trying to cheer him up and telling him that the world was not quite as bad a place as he thought it was. But he was the most wonderful friend. I'm sorry I didn't see more of him, and I miss him greatly, and can hear the sound of his voice in my ear when I'm going to sleep sometimes.
I think the first book which came out from the Wittgenstein Nachlass was this Philosophische Untersuchungen, which Elisabeth Anscombe translated as
translated
philosophical investigations. But they were already at that stage. There was some controversy about the first and second part.
Yes, there were.
What was the issue?
Well, the first part of the Philosophische Untersuchungen was a translation of a complete manuscript by Wittgenstein. The second part were some selections from notes he made, which were obviously extensions of the same of the further discussions of the topics he covered in the Philosophische Untersuchungen. But it was, I think, probably a mistake to include them as if they were meant by Wittgenstein to be part of the same book. I think was not Georg Henrik absent in some way when the decision was taken? He was ill, I think, and he regretted it, I think. The second one to be published, I think, was the Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics. Now, he had more responsibility for that, but again, I think he felt it was a pity to publish selections. And most of the later things that have been published are complete complete Wittgenstein manuscripts. I mean, manuscripts that were left in complete form by Wittgenstein. Perhaps I should say something about the, as it were, the different trends in philosophy, which one could call Wittgenstein's grandchildren. I mean, the different trends that have resulted from each of the trustees. The Ries, as I said, was the mystical side of Wittgenstein, and there was a school of philosophy of religion, mainly in Wales. Peter Geach, who disapproved of it, used to call it the Swansea sigh. It was in his view, a rather windy form of philosophy of religion. D.Z. Phillips, I think, was probably the but in my view, the most important of Ries's pupils was Winch, Peter Winch, whose book, The Idea of a Social Science, had a lot of influence on social scientists. I think it's still in print, and social scientists still recommend it to their students. Winch was Ries's choice as successor, to be Caesar to his Augustus, and because Ries died very shortly after I became a trustee, I saw a lot of Winch, and Winch was secretary of the trustees for a time. I had a great respect for Winch, and he was commonly an ally of Georg Henrik and myself if we were having difficulties with Anscombe. Anscombe herself, I think, had a considerable influence in philosophy of mind. She published a book, Intention, which many of us, myself included, have a lot of our ideas that we have published have derived from insights of hers in philosophy of in Intention, which was important both for the structure of practical thinking, but also for moral judgment. She wrote a famous article once called "Does Modern Moral Philosophy Corrupt the Young?" And she said that that she thought that modern moral philosophy was in a state of complete confusion in trying to combine consequentialist views of morality with law views of morality, when the two are not really capable of combination. But she, at that time, did not herself present any philosophy of mind, any moral philosophy, because she said, until we have got clear about philosophical psychology, about such concepts as intention, voluntariness, and so on, we will never be able to produce a proper moral philosophy. And so she saw her contribution as being to the prolegomena to ethics. But in fact, on one particular moral issue, she had an enormous influence, going way beyond philosophers, and that is on the issue of the just war. Anscombe first came to public notice in, I think it was 1948, when Oxford University conferred an honorary degree on President Truman of the United States. And Anscombe and a small group of others protested against this, saying that Truman was best known for two horrendous massacres at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was a disgrace for a university to honor him. And she wrote a little book called, a small pamphlet distributed, called Mr. Truman's Degree. And this set forth the traditional teaching on the doctrine of a just war, both in Aquinas and in Protestant theologians like Croceus, and showed how the use of the atom bomb against Japan was totally against the principles of the just war. Now, at that time, this was very much a minority topic, not just a minority view. I mean, I remember I lived through the war and remember no Roman Catholic bishop in England mentioned just war doctrine during the whole of the war. One Anglican bishop condemned the area bombing of Germany, but that was the thing. It was, as I say, it was not just a minority thing, it was a non-topic. Now, Anscombe got Catholics thinking about the just war as a result of this, and then gradually just war doctrine has become the orthodoxy even among military strategists. If you look at General Petraeus's Handbook of Counterinsurgency, which was issued to all American troops in Afghanistan about 8 years ago, I think, huge chunks of it are just the old just war doctrine as expounded by Anscombe. I mean, I doubt if he'd ever read Anscombe, but she kind of sowed the seed which made it a major issue. Now, I think I am.
This is very interesting because von Wright was also was famous for his critical public statements against the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And in Helsinki, he participated in peace demonstrations.
Yes. Now, as for the influence of the third of the trustees, Georg Henrik, I am the last person in this room to be able to say that. So would you like to tell us all about who you think are the people active in philosophy who are, as it were, Wittgenstein's grandchildren via von Wright?
Well, I think we have several of them in this audience, but one of the earliest students of von Wright was Jaakko Hintik.
Of course, yes.
Who certainly is the most famous of his students.
Of course, very famous.
And followed von Wright in the study of modal logic and epistemic logic, and so he's one of the persons, and Hintik has also been active in studying Wittgenstein. So but the influence of von Wright, we can see many persons here, and I could give floor to those who want to say something at this stage. Maybe Lars Hertzberg would be one of the persons who was very much influenced by von Wright. Yes. Yes. So we have a microphone.
Maybe more indirect, because he was never my teacher. He'd left for the Academy of Finland before I became a student. So actually my teacher was Erik Stenius, who also was a Wittgenstein scholar. And then I went to Cornell and studied with Norman Malcolm. So but later on in my life, I had lots of discussions with Georg Henrik, and I think on the whole, what was very important about him was this kind of openness that he represented about philosophy, thinking that people should be able to do philosophy in many different ways, and there was no correct way. So I mean, there's, for instance, I would say that if you compare Finnish philosophy to Swedish philosophy, that Swedish philosophy is much more monolithic. It's more formal, more philosophy of science oriented, whereas in Finland we have lots of different approaches, and I think that's very much due to von Wright. At the same time, I would say that he was not somebody who had followers in the strict sense. I mean, there are no real von Wrightians, I would say. People have been influenced by him, but not as followers.
Well, I would say that von Wright had enormous influence in the philosophy of law in Finland and in many other countries, and maybe Matti Sintonen would represent that group here in the audience.
I must say that I have stepped down as a professor of philosophy, so I'm a bit outdated. So I'm Matti Sintonen. I'm actually not a Wittgensteinian myself. I don't think so anyway. I can say that as a young man, about at the age of 15 or 16, I did read Wittgenstein like everybody. I mean, all proper philosophy students start with Wittgenstein's Tractatus because they don't understand a thing. And that often comes, true of the later stages. So I did start by reading Wittgenstein, and also, of course, I did start by reading von Wright. So one of the first revelations in books that I was reading was von Wright's Logic, Philosophy and Language, I think it is called. Not translated into English, I think. Which is an excellent introduction to philosophy, and still used widely here as a textbook. But I recently discovered that once some students who wanted to start studying philosophy at the university came to me and said there are some passages they don't understand in the book, and I had a look at the book and said I don't understand that either. So it took me half an hour to figure out what von Wright had in mind. That was about modal logic. And eventually I did find out what that was, but I discovered that the book was actually extremely complicated. So it's a great feat for anybody doing, a book on his or her own to be able to read that. And then, of course, I wrote my first piece. I was studying in America, actually also philosophy, when I was about 17. And I wrote an essay at school about Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And I only remember that I used some words that were not used the same way as in ordinary language, like propositions and things like that. And they were underlined by the teacher by red all around. but I got the highest marks anyway. As to philosophy of law, of course, Wittgenstein was highly influential in philosophy of law, and philosophy of law in Finland has been represented by quite a few people. I think perhaps the greatest name in philosophy of law is Aulis Aarnio, perhaps. Kaarlo Makkonen was a professor of jurisprudence at this university earlier on, but he was writing about legal decision making from a quite a different perspective. So that was not his. But Aulis Aarnio was very much influenced by Wittgenstein and also by von Wright. And Aulis Aarnio actually tried to use the practical syllogism to model the way lawyers actually make their decisions, or how students of law actually make their decisions also, which I think is false. I don't think it follows the practical syllogism work at all. I think it's a misguided idea. I don't know what Aulis Aarnio would think about this nowadays. And of course there are several others who have been doing philosophy of law who have had influences from Wittgenstein. But perhaps I should also mention one chap I think who has been highly influential and been influenced by Wittgenstein and been influenced by others, and that would be Stephen Toulmin, The Uses of Argument, which I think would be the best book to give any law student, I think, to think about reasoning, because he goes by the cases sort of thinking. So I think I value his writing on philosophy of law highly. I mean, uses of judgment, for instance, the idea of a judgment and the way you have the warrants and things like that, which is highly congenial, I think, as a representation of reasoning, at least to me. And of course, in this house, well, I mean, we used to have law in this house. You probably would be having a lot of people who have had influences from Wittgenstein and also von Wright, maybe Lars D. Eriksson to some extent, and I don't know. But perhaps that would be
Thank you.
enough.
That is very interesting to me, because I think in philosophy of law in England, Wittgenstein and von Wright's influence has been slight, really. I suppose because of Herbert Hart, who was not Wittgensteinian. A lot of his pupils, Dworkin and Raz and so on, are influential in philosophy of law. And, Raz knows his Wittgenstein, but I think there's very little direct influence.
Yeah, I could add that it was not only deontic logic which influenced the Finnish law community, but also the discussion about explanation and understanding.
Yes.
So this book has been widely read by the people in the humanities, in the social sciences. So it was very influential.
Well, the two von Wright books that were most influential, I think, in analytic Oxford anyway, were The Varieties of Goodness and Norm and Action. And they would influence them. Sorry, you were...
I think von Wright's, you mentioned something about von Wright thinking about the deontic logic being a mistake or something like that, not actually, coming through. And I think one reason is that he always speculated about the truth value of deontic sentences or claims. So that was the difficulty. And I think we had one occasion here, also in Helsinki, where we discussed this. And I think many people said that, well, until till the end, von Wright hesitated between the stand that they do have a truth value or that they do not. So I think that's why he probably didn't think that logic was the way to model deontology.
So then, of course, we have the Wittgenstein scholars like Thomas Wallgren. Would you, Tommy, say something? And also Bernd Österman, who's been working with the varieties of goodness.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Professor Kenny, for the words so far. I want to come back to one issue in your relation to the trustees and to Wittgenstein. One, you mentioned at the beginning as one important thing you share among the trustees and share with Wittgenstein, which is untypical for our time in philosophy, namely the stress on the difference between science and philosophy. You mentioned the information understanding, that kind of distinction. then the question I think many people would have with regard to that issue is, if philosophy doesn't deliver information or knowledge, then what is the worth of it? And I wonder if you would like to reflect a little bit on that. Also, whether you see differences between you, Georg Henrik von Wright and Wittgenstein in this respect, or do you think how close are you on this topic to each other?
I think that in answer to your first question, I think that a lot of science, at least of popular science, is full of philosophical confusion. And the philosopher can bring out the confusion and assist the scientist by clearing out some of the muddles in the scientist's mind. Now, of course, the philosopher is not trying to second guess the scientist's scientific results. It is when the scientist tries to popularize and translate into everyday language what he or she has discovered, that the confusion can arise. And the philosopher who has reflected on the nature of language, and I think this, of course, is another thing which we all shared with Wittgenstein, believing that language is central to philosophical understanding, and that the analysis of language is one of the most important tasks of the philosopher. That is something that the philosopher can do. One of my closest colleagues, who was also a great admirer of Georg Henrik, and I think Georg Henrik admired him, is Peter Hacker, who writes about the philosophy of mind, and published a remarkable book with a neuroscientist called The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. It was in conjunction with an Australian neurophysiologist. And Hacker was able to show that a lot of the practical conclusions that neurophysiologists draw from what they have discovered about the brain are quite misleading. And I think Hacker was very wise to write this book in conjunction with a neuroscientist, because the scientist would have just laughed it off, saying, oh, it's just the philosophers muttering about language. But I think that I don't know, I think that the philosophy has the relationship to scientific thinking that toothbrush and toothpicks have to eating and digesting. Now, I didn't. Your second question was how much. Yes, how much was in common with von Wright? We actually spent so much time dealing with the Nachlass that we had very little time to discuss philosophy together. But of course, we exchanged our papers with each other, and I think that we had little disagreement about philosophy, but we quite often disagreed about the history of philosophy quite sharply. But that's something I will be talking about tomorrow.
Well, Bernd Österman made his PhD on on the concept of goodness.
Yes.
So that's
Yes,
a relation to von Wright.
Yes,
Yes.
perhaps we can. I was young at that time, and I had him just 10 meters from me in his room or something like that. But I really never discussed the thing with him, although I wrote about it. That was a kind of. It's extremely silly when you think about it now. So what he got from me was already it was already manuscript, and then he looked at it and said that, oh, this seems to be a serious work. That was all. But it was about the varieties of goodness, and I noticed that you mentioned it, that it was influential and so on. And it's quite interesting because his own view was that it was his best work, but it was the work that wasn't appreciated really much, because somehow I don't know how he expressed it. I think he said something like it hardly left any trace. And that's me, so I'm included in the hardly any trace, I suppose. But I mean, I have later discovered that there were people like Judith Jarvis Thompson, for instance, who made a lot of was very much influenced by his philosophy of value and so on. So it is a little bit of a myth also that it wasn't influential. But I think I think what he meant was perhaps the kind of in between metaethics and normative ethics that is present in the book, about this how he has this idea about how moral goodness is molded somehow. And not there to be described as the other forms of goodness are. They are somehow there to be described, and then moral goodness presupposes some sort of philosophical. You have the philosopher has something to interfere and make the concept somehow depending on his own values, but still following the kind of framework set by the other forms of goodness. And this was quite original idea that obviously it wasn't much appreciated or understood, or I don't know.
I think it was, as you say, it is not much referred to by people, but I think it had an influence that was, as it were, unnoticeable, because many things which he said, people said, oh yes, and then they kind of took for granted what he had said rather than referring to it. One effect was that at the time when he wrote it, analytic philosophers were all extremely keen on a sharp distinction between ethics and morality, ethics or metaethics, whichever you prefer. And that has more or less disappeared now. There are a lot of books are dealing together with both metaethics and with practical moral problems. And I think, as you say, the contribution of the varieties of goodness was to show that you could do both things without confusing one with the other.
Thomas.
Thank you. We will have time, I think, for more questions. But I'd like to come back to one topic which you mentioned, which is a question of the relation to our times, which among the trustees, if we think of Ries, Anscombe, and von Wright, would you agree that von Wright is the one who shares Wittgenstein's concern about progress and modernity and our times more than the others, and also a rather pessimistic outlook on that? So that's something that maybe, do you think that had anything to do with Wittgenstein's decision to appoint von Wright, or is it a thing that only came later to von Wright and Wittgenstein? How do you see that concern about what happens in our times and its relevance for the relation between von Wright, Wittgenstein, and your views on this, on the two thinkers?
Well, I think that that I'm not sure about this, but I think that Wittgenstein, Anscombe, and von Wright all shared the view that we live in very dark times. I mean, that dark times appears, doesn't it, in a preface to one of Wittgenstein's books. And Anscombe certainly thought that this was a wickedly sinful world. It was getting worse, I think. I mean, not just the big sins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but thought that most of us were living in a sinful state without realizing it. But of course, in von Wright, it did not have the theological overtones that it had in Anscombe, and I think they all took it as a mark of seriousness, that anybody who was really serious must think that the world we live in is a pretty bad place. I mean, I once said to Elizabeth, what do you think was the main thing you got from Wittgenstein? And she said, seriousness. And that was her word for it. Yes, I mean, von Wright, one of his main arguments for pessimism is, I think, very difficult to refute. I mean, he draws attention to the fact that most of us in the West we enjoy a style of life which is far above what is necessary for elementary health and comfort and so on. That the rest of the world is all gradually going to come to wish to live at the same standard. That for us all to live at that standard would be quite insupportable, and that this is therefore bound to lead to warfare, and that warfare will sooner or later become nuclear warfare, and therefore we have a very black future to look forward to. I mean, for Anscombe it was rather different. We are all wicked in a way that is going to lead to us ending up in hell, but you know, it is they run along parallel tracks.
Okay, Sami Billström has recently written on von Wright and many other things. So, Sami.
Well, thanks. I thought of asking a question related to philosophy of religion. You mentioned this Swansea school in relation to Ross Reason and then of course D.Z. Phillips and also Winch to some extent developed those ideas and it has been known as Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion, which has been a relatively minor tradition if you think about philosophy of religion as a whole. But I basically wanted to ask you about von Wright's relation to this orientation in philosophy of religion in particular, and maybe to philosophy of religion more generally, because of course von Wright was never really working on philosophy of religion very much. That clearly was not among his key topics, although he worked on many themes. And it's clear that he wasn't religious. He wasn't a religious thinker. But then, on the other hand, you might see some sort of openness. I mean, you were also talking about his openness to many themes. And if you read, for instance, the early essays on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and other great writers, for instance, it seems that there is a kind of an openness to themes that are also like existential and religious. Although, of course, there is nothing like the mysticism you might find in Ross Rees. So I'm just wondering how you would see, in general terms, von Wright's relation to philosophy of religion and also maybe more specifically his view on this special Wittgensteinian orientation in that field associated with Winch and Rees and Phillips.
I didn't ever discuss Winch and Rees with him, so I don't exactly know the answer to that. But I think, I mean, what seems to me wrong with the Swansea tradition is that they see religious language as a special language game on its own. And I don't think that's right. I think religious language is essentially metaphorical, and of course a metaphor is not a new language game. It is using words which belong in one language game and using them outside that language game. Now, I think the link I would see with von Wright was that he also, I think, was very open to metaphorical understanding of religion. And I think that it was... I don't think he was ever anti-religious. Neither in writing nor in conversation have I heard him mock religion at all. I think he was very respectful to it. The same, of course, is true of Wittgenstein, at least of the later Wittgenstein. And in the early Wittgenstein, religion would certainly be among the things that could only be shown and not said. But then, only 10 years or so after the Tractatus, he is saying things like, "Why are you afraid of nonsense?" Quoting Augustine, "Ve tacentibus de te," and saying, utter nonsense if you wish. It won't do you any harm. But just keep an eye on your nonsense. I mean, that was his kind of, I think, later approach to philosophy of religion. But then, of course, for other things which von Wright published in Culture and Value about Christianity and St. Paul in that. Anscombe had a great contempt for everything that Wittgenstein wrote on religion. She once said to me that that all her thoughts really came from Wittgenstein, except, she said, on religion he is just sheer poison. Too pathetic, she said.
Now, von Wright's first teacher, Eino Kaila, whose father was archbishop.
Oh, really?
Kaila was very critical of organized religious doctrines and church. So that's an interesting connection.
It is a common phenomenon among bishops' children. I have observed it.
Okay, Lasse Herzberg.
Could I ask about what you said about philosophical method at the beginning, when you talked about the difference between philosophy and science? As in philosophy we organize knowledge or organize information, and now there are other sort of students of Wittgenstein who would describe what they're doing in terms of a form of therapy. When people like Cora Diamond, for instance, would you disagree with that way of characterizing it, or is that? And also, would there be a difference if you think about von Wright in relation to Wittgenstein? I mean, with regard to therapy versus organization.
Well, I suppose when I was talking about toothpaste and toothpicks, I was talking about a very elementary form of therapy. But the way in which I think for Wittgenstein philosophy is therapy is that you have the scientist and all of us have in our heads some confused ideas which we express in propositions which are literally nonsense. And I agree to this extent with people like Cora Diamond, is that I think that the argumentation in the philosophical investigations is not strictly argumentation. It is not arguing from true premises by a formally valid method to true conclusions. What it is usually starting with is something which people might hold, a private language, say, and then treating it with respect as if it was a proposition, and then trying to apply to it what looks like a valid method of formal argument, but gradually showing that it leads to nothing. Because it's a piece of nonsense, it doesn't have a truth value, therefore it can't form part of a valid bit of argumentation, even a valid reductio ad absurdum. And what it's meant to lead to is not to somebody accepting the opposite. So there is no private language. It is just that they stop wanting to make the kinds of utterances that would be appropriate about language, if there could be such a thing as a private language.
Now, one of the fields which has not been mentioned is aesthetics, and Hanne Appelqvist has written about Wittgenstein and and aesthetics. So, Hanne, would you say something?
Actually, my question wasn't about
Okay, but you frame your own on question.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask about philosophy of religion to kind of follow up on Sami's and also what you said about the metaphorical interpretation of the Christian faith or Christian religion. You mentioned before that in the Tractatus what Wittgenstein is saying, or the point there is that we shouldn't talk about religion at all or religious notions. But then at the same time, in Wittgenstein's early work, we do get plenty of remarks on God, God as the world, and prayer, for instance, as the contemplation of the meaning of the world. So would you say that this is an example of interpreting religion metaphorically, in the sense that you have been...
Not, I think, not in the early works. Though you probably have them fresher in your mind than I do, because I think that one of the things about contemplation is that it doesn't express itself in propositions. Contemplation is a silent activity. It does not violate whereof one cannot speak. Whereof one should be silent.
Okay, other questions? Yes, here.
I'm Timo Karjala, and I do not know very much of philosophy, but I remember from Wittgenstein that he wrote that wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. And I think that this is one example of those things that one must take for granted when one make philosophy or in other jobs. And I wonder that what are these things that Wittgenstein took for granted when he wrote Tractatus, and did he change his mind in old days about these things that are for granted?
I don't think that the category of things whereof one cannot speak is the same as the category of things that one takes for granted. I don't think that he was taking the existence of God for granted in the Tractatus. It was something not to be talked of. Later, in uncertainty, there are things that are taken for granted. For instance, that cats do not grow on trees. And he thinks that the propositions like that are a very special kind of propositions, because on the one hand they sound like empirical propositions. On the other hand, they are not discovered by experience. It would be absurd to set up an experiment. And I think to his dying day he was a bit uncertain as to what the right philosophical slot was to put these things, and also uncertain how many propositions there were that belonged in this strange group. It's the uncertainty begins with a reference to John Henry Newman, a rather puzzling one, and it turns out that that the things that the kind of proposition that Wittgenstein lists in uncertainty are very similar to the ones that Newman offers of things that we believe but not on the basis of evidence. Newman gives as an example that Great Britain is an island. Actually, of course, nowadays you could have evidence for that because of photographs, but Newman says, of course we all believe that Great Britain is an island, but have you ever circumnavigated it? Or have you met anyone who circumnavigates it? And he thinks it's the category of things that are more certain than any evidence you could offer for them. Another one is that we are all going to die, and so on. I think Newman's Grammar of Assent is a remarkable book. It was very much neglected because of its religious motive, but I think just as a work of philosophy, it's very good. Henry Price, the Oxford philosopher who was himself an atheist, and wrote a book on belief, and he said, between Hume and Wittgenstein there is only Newman, who has written sensibly about belief.
Thomas, still. Yes.
There is a follow-up on the question of aesthetics. Something you said about Anscombe, but several things you've said about Anscombe are new to me. One is this thing about her views on Wittgenstein's views on religion.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, one of the many puzzling things that Wittgenstein says is this idea that ethics and aesthetics are one.
Yeah.
What is your understanding of that saying by Wittgenstein? And is it related to Anscombe's negative view, what he has to say about religion? Is there a connection there? I mean, the absolute sort of featuring more in aesthetics and ethics, perhaps, than in his views of religion.
I'm not sure. I don't think there is a connection, but I can't be sure because I'm not sure what Wittgenstein really meant by ethics and aesthetics. I want. I have spent the last 2 years retranslating Aristotle's ethical works. Jonathan Barnes, who was once my pupil and long my colleague, he published many years ago the Oxford collected works of Aristotle. It's published actually by Princeton University Press, but it's owned by Oxford. And Princeton University Press 2 years ago asked him to revise the ethical works of Aristotle, Nicomachean, Eudemian, Magnum Aurelia, and David Euthyphus. And Jonathan, to my great pleasure, said he would do it only if I would collaborate with him. So I spent a lot of time with Jonathan, mainly by email, because he lives in France, over these 2 years. We have now completed it. It should appear in a month or two. But one of the things we had to discuss was the translation of the Greek word kalon. Now, kalon in Greek means both beautiful and morally admirable. And so from time to time, Jonathan and I would say, does that mean Aristotle thought ethics and aesthetics were one? I think the answer is that he didn't, but I think it shows that the overlap between concepts is different in Greek and in Greek and English. Now, I doubt if what Wittgenstein meant was what was connected with the Aristotelian view of ethics. I suspect that it is more likely to link to ideas in Schopenhauer, but I'm not so sure of that. But I mean, we do know that Schopenhauer is one of the few 19th century philosophers that Wittgenstein took seriously, and the influence of the will in Schopenhauer was something that he thought was very important. And of course it is common to ethics and aesthetics that they both concern the will, the affective powers, more than the intellect.
Okay, maybe we have still time for one, at least one
As you
more.
mentioned Schopenhauer, I read from his book, I don't remember the name anymore, but he wrote that a man and a woman can see in theory everything but not his own eye or her own eye. Do you think this is a truth which is truth as for granted?
I don't really understand what he meant by it.
I mean that I think it is impossible for me to see my eye, because I only see a mirror,
I mean, I think
a reflection of my eye in a
mirror. It's literally true, but what the point was that Schopenhauer wanted to make with it, I'm not sure yet.
Things which are taken for granted. And the philosophy of Schopenhauer is, I think, based on a set of such things, as well as I think it is the philosophy of Wittgenstein and other philosophies. And the problem is that it is very difficult to make clear which are those axioms or starting points which they take as for granted. Because this is, I think, one of the main reasons why so many people misunderstand the ideas of philosophy, as Wittgenstein, I think, mentioned.
I'd just like to clarify one point. I think that whether at the beginning of his life or the end of his life, the things that we take for granted are not starting points for Wittgenstein. I mean, one of the things that he is very much against is the idea, which is in Descartes and others, that philosophy is a kind of axiomatic system with some self-evident truths which you begin with and then everything comes from them. He thinks that you can begin philosophy anywhere. I mean, if it is a dissolution of problems, then you take a problem and dissolve it. And he also, because you can start it anywhere, you can cease it anywhere. He says the real discovery in philosophy is that which enables me to cease when I want.
Okay, I think we have, during this discussion, we have seen how many issues from Wittgenstein and von Wright are still alive among us. So could I end with a personal question? There are, of course, many opinions who was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And many people would vote for Wittgenstein. What would be your personal view?
That would be my view too, yes.
Okay.
And I would certainly put Anscombe and von Wright in a kind of lesser, but among, I mean, if I was asked who were the second best philosopher of the century, there would be, maybe 20 I would mention, but they would be two. It's hard to know what to make of Russell, I think, because Russell certainly initially promised to be one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, but collapsed into the most trivial writing towards the end of his life. But I would still want to put him among the greats. And I think that was Wittgenstein's view, wasn't he? Wittgenstein always took the early Russell seriously, but then said he suffered from loss of problems, I think was what Wittgenstein said. That, and I think that was true. And I mean, Ray Monk's Life of Wittgenstein, I think, is rather good. Ray Monk's Life of Russell presents a man who is utterly contemptible. I think, and I don't think Russell was utterly contemptible. I think Ray Monk should have given up writing his life once he came to the conclusion that, I mean, some of his behavior was undoubtedly utterly contemptible. But
so, Professor Kenny, I think it's time to close this discussion, and thank you very much for your very enlightening remarks.
Thank you, I enjoyed it very
and let me remind you that tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the small hall in the main building, we will continue on important topics with Professor Kenny.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.